Good evening, everyone. My name is Gabriel Meyer, and I'm the Executive Director of the Ruskin Art Club. On behalf of the club's Board of Directors, I'd like to welcome you all to this first of 3 lectures on Ruskin and the American Transcendentalists, focusing on Emerson, Thoreau, and the naturalist John Muir. It's a kind of mini conference. It's part of an effort that we undertake from time to time to highlight the influence of British art and social critic John Ruskin on America, an influence that created, among many other movements and associations, the Ruskin Art Club in Los Angeles some 133 years ago. For a man who never set foot on American soil, Ruskin had a surprisingly powerful, and may I add, underreported influence on American artists, thinkers, and social movements, which is why we do these programs. I can't resist sharing a quote I came across a few weeks ago. An open letter Ruskin published in The Crayon, which was America's first professional arts journal in 1855. Quote, "I have much to thank America for," Ruskin wrote, indicating that America had given him, quote, "a heartier appreciation than I ever met in England. Nothing gives me greater pleasure than the thought of being use to an American. And if I can in my way oblige any Americans who are interested in art, I beg that you will call on me," end quote. Well, this cheery sentiment, as readers of Ruskin will note, stands in fairly stark contrast to the serious reservations Ruskin expresses in his later writings on the subject of America's political institutions and ideals. I'm now going to turn the program over to our good friend, Professor Jim Spates, Emeritus Professor of Sociology at Hobart and William Smith Colleges in Geneva, New York, member of the Ruskin Art Club, co-director of the Ruskin Society of North America, companion of the Guild of St. George, and Ruskin scholar and dear friend, who will introduce our speaker. Jim? Jim, you're muted.
Jim, you're muted.
Now you should be able to. Can you hear me now?
Yes. Thank you, Jim.
Okay, good. Well, thank you, Gabriel. I'm delighted to be able to do this tonight, to have a chance to talk to all you good folks who have come aboard to hear another great talk about Ruskin in the cyber world. And of course, there's some question about what he would have thought about the cyber world, but we may not probably get to that tonight. In any event, my task is to introduce Sara Atwood, who's a very dear friend. And last year, she and I and a number of dedicated others who care very much about Ruskin and his work decided to found the Ruskin Society of North America, which we did, and we got great reception about the doing so from our English compatriots who also care very much about Ruskin, particularly the folks at the Guild of St. George, which Ruskin founded in the 1870s. In any event, you're in for a treat tonight. Sara Atwood, who's our speaker, whom I will tell you a little bit more about in just a moment. Sara very kindly shared a copy of her talk with me before tonight's event, and I have gone through it, and I think you are in for a real treat. And Gabriel Meyer and the Ruskin Art Club are to be applauded. I don't know whether we do standing ovations when we're Zooming, but in any event, I would say that Gabriel and his crew deserve a standing ovation for all the good things that they're doing to get Ruskin's ideas and thoughts about in the world as time goes on. So thank you, Gabriel and the Ruskin Art Club, for your sponsorship. So it is my pleasure and my delight to introduce Sara Atwood to you. If you don't know much about Sara, Here's a little bit. Her book, Ruskin's Educational Ideals, was published by Ashgate Press in 2011. And that certainly was not the end of her scholarly work, as you will hear tonight. She's had further publications in various contributions to for example, the Yale University Press edition of Carlyle on Heroes, Hero Worship, and the Hero in History, in Teaching Victorian Literature in the 21st Century in Palgrave in 2017. And John Ruskin in the 19th Century Education Process, Anthem Press 2018, and William Morris and John Ruskin, A New Road on Which the World Should Travel, University of Exeter Press 2019. So Sara has been anything but unbusy since her book came out. It's a very fine book. It is the major book on Ruskin and education, as far as I know. She has lectured widely on Ruskin, both in the US and abroad, particularly the UK, and she's focused primarily on education. She is our Ruskin and education maven in the Ruskin world. She's also talked quite a lot about Ruskin and environment and language. And she's co-director with me, as I mentioned a few moments ago, of the Ruskin Society in North America. She's a board member of the Ruskin Art Club and a companion of the Guild of St. George in the UK. The Guild, as I think I mentioned at the top of my remarks, was founded by Ruskin in the 1870s. His idea was to reform the world while he yet had time. 100 years old, approaching 150, and it's thriving, and we're delighted to be part of it. I'm also a companion of the Guild, as is Gabriel Meyer. Sara teaches English literature and writing at Portland Community College in Oregon, and so we welcome her tonight. The title of her talk, as I think most of you know, is Ruskin and the Transcendentalists, the first of 3 talks on Ruskin and the Transcendentalists. And the subtitle is Black Devil, Gentle Cloud, Ruskin and Emerson. And I think you will be as delighted as I was to read it. So Sara, the floor is yours.
Okay, I think you can hear me now. Thank you all for being here. I think I'm able to share my screen now, and I do have slides I'm going to show you tonight. So I'll go ahead and put those up before I get started and forget to put them up, which would be bad. Here we go. Okay, and let me just get that on slideshow. I've lost my mouse here. Hold on. I've lost my mouse. Okay, there we go. All right. All right, so thank you all for being here. I'm glad that you could make it. This is the first time I've given a lecture on Zoom. I teach on Zoom all the time, and I also teach an adult class in the evening on Zoom. So I'm familiar with Zoom, I'm comfortable with it, but I haven't given a lecture on Ruskin yet. So this is a first for me. We were just talking beforehand about how the last time Gabriel and Jim and I were in person at a lecture was at the end of 2019, and who knew what was going to happen shortly after that. So I'm really glad that we were able to keep doing these sort of events and welcome people in. And I think that, this is actually a way that even to reach more people, because people who are not close by and might not be able to make it can still be here. So welcome. I'm just going to go ahead and get started. In 1873, 2 of the most eminent Victorians met in person for the first time at Oxford. John Ruskin, then Slade Professor of Art, was at 54 one of the best known public figures of the age. Widely regarded for his writings on art, he had by this time firmly established himself as a social critic as well, and was embarked upon a visionary scheme of social transformation. Ralph Waldo Emerson, making what would be his final visit to Europe, was 70 this year and in failing health. His reputation as, quote, the spiritual guide of many thousands on both sides of the Atlantic stood firm. The 2 men had often admired one another's work, and their meeting promised to be memorable. Yet in the event, these 2 great minds did not so much meet as collide. They argued and parted ways. What affinities had drawn the 2 together, and what was it that precipitated their rupture at Oxford? Professor Max Mueller, who was present at their 1873 meeting, remembers Ruskin and Emerson in his autobiography as old friends, and in many ways, cognate souls. They shared many of the same concerns and convictions, and wielded a similarly powerful national influence. Ruskin's early remarks about Emerson express his regard. He said, "I'm very glad you like Emerson." This is in a letter to his father in 1861. "Mama has a horror of these people, Carlyle, etc., because she thinks they pervert me, but I never understand them till I find the thing out for myself. After 10 years hard work, I find out that every man does his best thing easiest. Then I find the brief sentence in Emerson and am pleased, but he does not teach it me." There are many admiring references to Emerson throughout Ruskin's work. He commends the wisdom of the closing lines of Emerson's fable of the mountain and the squirrel, and favorably cites poems such as Rhea, The World's Soul, and Forbearance. In Praeterita, Ruskin names Emerson, along with Longfellow and Lowell, as one of, quote, the really progressive leaders of thought in his own country. Emerson, for his part, had read and admired modern painters and heard news of Ruskin from their mutual friend, Carlyle. He agreed with Ruskin's declaration that all great art is praise. In 1871, he was much impressed by Ruskin's The Two Paths, and we are told that he praised it at every meal. Yet for all their apparent sympathy, the relationship between Ruskin and Emerson is more complex than such instances of mutual admiration would suggest. Considered closely, there appears to be more antagonism than affinity between them. As Mueller observes in his memoirs, in order to judge of a man, we ought to know in what quarry the marble of which he was made was carved. From the start, Ruskin's and Emerson's characters and ideas were shaped by very different cultural and intellectual forces. There's little similarity in their upbringing, family life, or education. This is Ruskin's home at Herne Hill, a photograph of the home that he grew up in. Ruskin was the only child of committed and affluent evangelical parents, schooled at home and by tutors, given the freedom to enjoy art, literature, theater, the good fortune to travel both abroad and at home, the means with which to pursue his interests in geology, mineralogy, and drawing, and the opportunity to study as a gentleman commoner at Oxford. Here are some of Ruskin's artworks, just to give you an idea of his talent as an artist, and also of the things he was interested in and drew and looked at and closely observed. Ruskin was in many ways a product of the Romantic tradition, which helped to shape his view of nature and art. His ideas naturally evolved over the course of a long life, yet certain fundamental characteristics were forged early on. His powers of observation and interest in vision and perception, his sensitivity to the natural world and engagement with natural history, his love of art and architecture, you can see all that in these pictures, his reverence for God and respect for monarchy, his preoccupation with the past and its lessons, his strong attachment to an ideal of England, all were inculcated in what he was later to call the forming time, in which a man makes himself or is made that which he is forever to be. Emerson's early life, though also defined by religion and learning, was different in important ways. He was a third of 6 sons, born in Boston to a Unitarian minister and his wife. The family was respectable, though not well off. Emerson's father, William, was educated and bookish, but died in 1812, when Emerson was only 8 years old. He seems to have left little impression on his son. Emerson's religious strain derives instead from his mother, Ruth, while his intellectual growth was influenced by his aunt, Mary Moody Emerson, whom Emerson later claimed had provided that which nothing else in my education could supply. Self-educated, widely read, and eccentric, Mary Emerson has been described as a deitistic pietist who embraced Christ as a mediator, but looked forward to a time when she could do without him. Emerson copied out and studied her letters and writings, observing in 1851 that Aunt Mary is a genius always new, subtle, frolicsome, judicial, unpredictable. Emerson began attending Boston Latin School at age 9. At 14, he entered Harvard. Here's a picture of Harvard in 1836. At that time, it was a small, nondescript place, half boys' school, half center for advanced study. And he took a work study position in order to help with his college fees. Emerson was strongly influenced by the Scottish common sense philosophy that pervaded the intellectual atmosphere of Harvard during his college days. And he immersed himself in the work of such writers as Adam Smith, Thomas Brown, and Dugald Stewart. He was particularly drawn to Stewart's account of the history of modern thought, his rejection of Hume, and affirmation of universal moral perceptions. The biographer Robert D. Richardson claims that to a great extent, Emerson's life and work, indeed transcendentalism itself, constitutes a refutation of Hume. German philosophy, which Ruskin considered both impenetrable and inadequate, and German biblical criticism pervaded the intellectual life of New England and of Massachusetts in particular, and was another significant influence. Emerson's brother William, as well as several friends, traveled to Göttingen to study with the leading lights of the German school. Emerson did not accompany them, but absorbed their accounts of German thinkers and ideas. After graduation, he traveled to Europe, returning home to teach first at a girls' school run by his mother, and then at a school of his own founding, before entering Harvard Divinity School in 1825. Yet after ordination in 1829, he served as a minister for only 3 years before resigning. Like Ruskin, Emerson had grown away from the religion of his childhood. While both Emerson and Ruskin read widely and counted a day without study as wasted, there's a feverish element to Emerson's pursuit of knowledge that seems related, at least in part, to a particularly American fear of intellectual inferiority. There was more than an ocean separating England and America, and the cultural distance between cosmopolitan London and rural Concord needs measuring as well. As a member of the English upper middle class, Ruskin was heir to an established tradition of intellectual and aesthetic culture. His understanding of history was informed by the long ages of Europe, which fed his strong sense of place. The landscapes he loved were rich with meaning and memory. This cultural and historical grounding nurtured his reverence for the past. Independence you had better cease to talk of, Ruskin counseled readers of Forskavidra, for you are dependent not only on every act of people whom you never heard of, who are living round you, but on every past act of what has been dust for 1,000 years. So also does the course of 1,000 years to come depend upon the little perishing strength that is in you. This confident sense of continuity has much to do with Ruskin's sense of England's noble history and his own claim in it. His disgust with the failures of modern England springs from the conviction that England might be made a country again of kings, a sceptered isle, for all the world a source of light and a center of peace. As Stuart Eagles has observed, Ruskin's appeal was in important ways peculiarly British, and this very Britishness is essential to his character and thinking. It was given practical, some would say impractical expression in the Guild of St. George, which was intended to revive and reverence English land and ideals. Growing up in a young country still trying to define itself, Emerson lacked Ruskin's cultural certainty. The earliest years of the newly established American Republic have been spent in nation building. The creation of physical and political infrastructure necessarily preceded cultural development. Emerson was born only 20 years after the Treaty of Paris ended the American Revolution. Thus, while the European heritage was available to him and his contemporaries, it was not their lived experience. They were at a cultural as well as a geographical remove. This was especially true in matters of art. Emerson's relative lack of knowledge about art, despite his visual nature, is directly related to the absence of a settled American artistic tradition and to the want of adequate galleries and collections. Intelligent Americans knew that Europe was awaiting the result of their political experiment. As R.B. Stein notes, proud as they were of commercial prowess, Americans did not wish to be stigmatized as petty bourgeois, Philistine, a nation of Yankee peddlers. Concord, where Emerson settled in 1835, could boast proximity to rapidly growing Boston, as well as its own circle of serious intellectuals, many of whom could not be accused of wearing their learning lightly. Bronson Alcott, Margaret Fuller, Thoreau, Ellery Channing, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and others numbered among its residents. By mid-century, the town had become shorthand for this group of well-known thinkers and for the transcendental philosophy that many of them embraced. Louisa May Alcott, Bronson's novelist daughter, wrote with affectionate humor that Concord was, quote, popularly believed to be the hotbed of genius. It was nonetheless a small town with a population of just over 2,000 souls in 1835. It was a pleasant, attractive place, and Emerson's home, called Bush, was its intellectual hub. This is now a museum today. Americans were torn between the need to construct a culture of their own and the towering example of Europe. Something of this anxiety underlies Emerson's bold calls for self-reliance and a unique American tradition. On his first journey to Europe in 1832, Emerson defensively hedged his admiration, asserting more strongly than he had ever done before his sense of his own Americanness. In his first published book, Nature, 1836, he asks, why should we grope among the dry bones of the past or put the living generation into masquerade out of its faded wardrobe? There are new lands, new men, new thoughts. Let us demand our own works and laws and worship. Working out his principle of self-reliance, Emerson urged readers to find intellectual satisfaction at home. It is for want of self-culture, he declares, that the superstition of traveling, whose idols are Italy, England, Egypt, retains its fascination for all educated Americans. While his insistence on the primacy of the individual has a universal appeal, it's nonetheless driven by a very American anxiety. In this sense, Emersonian self-reliance is a uniquely American notion. The success of his 1837 book, The American Scholar, enthusiastically received at the time and still considered an essential declaration of American intellectual independence, has much to do with this unease, which he encouraged his audience to overcome. Our day of dependence, our long apprenticeship to the learning of other lands draws to a close, he declared. We have listened too long to the courtly muses of Europe. The spirit of the American free man is already suspected to be timid, imitative, tame. This isn't an argument for American exceptionalism, although it has often been misrepresented as such. Unlike today's fundamentalist patriots, however, Emerson never shrank from acknowledging national failings. His resistance to European influence was rooted in the cultural tension between the old world and the new. And England was an especially formidable challenge to Americans. As Emerson conceded, in all that is done or begun by the Americans toward right thinking or practice, we are met by a civilization already settled and overpowering. England had spread its influence over the globe. With English Traits, published in 1856, Emerson sought to come to terms with English history, culture, customs, religion, and people. Yet one suspects that this book was also cathartic, a means of freeing himself and his country of a cultural albatross, so as to embrace instead, quote, the bird of a new morning, which forgets the past world in the full enjoyment of that which is forming. Emerson recognized a source of strength in America's newness. The nation, like the vast land it occupied, was ripe with possibility. English Traits is unabashedly critical, despite Emerson's admiration for many aspects of English culture. An Irish reviewer offered a wry account of the book. Now comes a book on England from a friendly hand. Emerson, conscientious and therefore involved philosopher, who after study through the foreign country, purified by reflections and repose in his own land, is as sagaciously, sententiously impartial as Cicero upon Athens. The patient must shrink under this awful analysis. Emerson finds the Englishman a mighty worker, but a deadly blockhead. He admires them as he admires ants. Their industry superb, but its objects being to him inscrutable, he declares the results nil outside the nest. The American spiritualist arraigns the hideous materialism of England, her commercial cynicism, her political infidelity, her desperation of dissent, her atheism, which does not even take the forlorn French form of a faith in humanity. And that review was published in The Nation. Some of the faults that Emerson identified in English Traits were those for which Ruskin would arraign England in the coming decades. Indeed, condemning food adulteration and forced clovidra, Ruskin cites Emerson's account of the subject in English Traits. Yet while Ruskin considered Emerson's book occasionally wise and always observant as to matters actually proceeding in the world, he bristled at Emerson's attitude towards tradition. Ruskin's unorthodox vision of reform was underpinned by a very orthodox attachment to order, tradition, hierarchy, and old certainties. He reacted with indignation to Emerson's characterization of his beloved St. George as, quote, a low parasite who got a lucrative contract to supply the army with bacon, a rogue and an informer who was lynched as he deserved. Ruskin, a professed monarchist who maintained the necessity of social hierarchies in maintaining a healthy social balance, also disagreed with Emerson's disdain for noble privileges and titles. And as I think most of you know, and Gabriel may have mentioned, Ruskin never visited America. While he admired individual Americans and counted several amongst his friends, he had no great admiration for the nation as a whole. Yet it was more than America's lack of castles that worried him. He once said he would never visit a nation that had no castles. The faith in liberty and equality that underlay the American experiment was at odds with Ruskin's deeply held belief in natural inequality, obedience and restraint, and interdependence. My American friends, he wrote in Time and Tide, tell me that I know nothing of America. It may be so, and they must do me the justice to observe that I therefore usually say nothing about America. But this much I have said, because the Americans as a nation set their trust in liberty and in equality, of which I detest the one and deny the possibility of the other. And because also, as a nation, they are wholly undesirous of rest and incapable of it, irreverent of themselves, both in the present and in the future, discontented with what they are, yet having no ideal of anything which they desire to become. Ruskin maintained that America was neither a republic nor a democracy, that in fact, there has never yet been in America any such thing as an institution, but only defiance of institution, neither any such thing as a res publica, but only a multitudinous res privata, for every man for himself. It is not republicanism that fails now in America. It is your model science of political economy brought to its perfect practice. There you may see competition and the law of demand and supply in beautiful and unhindered operation, lust of wealth and trust in it, vulgar faith in magnitude and multitude instead of nobleness, perpetual self-contemplation issuing in passionate vanity, total ignorance of the finer and higher arts, and of all that they teach and bestow, and the discontent of energetic minds unoccupied, frantic with hope of uncomprehended change and progress they know not whither. That's quite an indictment. Of course, Ruskin identified many of these faults in England as well, but America's relative newness, its political philosophy, and its want of long-established historical and cultural traditions made it seem even more susceptible. This was just the sort of assessment that Americans both feared and rejected. While Emerson urged his countrymen to write their own national story, Ruskin urged the English, do not attempt to learn from America. An Englishman has brains enough to discover for himself what is good for England and should learn, when he is to be taught anything, from his fathers, not from his children. So despite many apparent correspondences, Emerson's and Ruskin's ideas had been forged in different fires, and they bore the marks of their distinctive tempering. Mueller's description of their 1873 meeting, taken in its entirety, hints at the gulf that separated them. These cognate souls, he tells us, ended by disagreeing. Some quite indifferent subject turned up, he wrote. A heated discussion ensued, and Ruskin was so upset that he had to quit the room and leave us alone. Ruskin's and Emerson's memories of the meeting are more telling. Ruskin wrote a friend, Emerson came to my rooms a day or two ago. I found his mind a total blank on matters of art and had a fearful sense of the whole being of him as a gentle cloud, intangible. Emerson, looking back, recalled, I had seen Ruskin at Oxford and had been charmed by his manner in the lecture room, but in talking with him at his rooms, I found myself wholly out of sympathy with Ruskin's views of the world. I wonder such a genius can be possessed by so black a devil. I cannot pardon him for a despondency so deep. It is detestable in a man of such powers, in a poet, a seer, such as he has been. These are strikingly perceptive and at the same time devastating insights, for each man effectively convicts the other of lacking the one thing essential to a right understanding of the world, true vision. Ruskin's dismissal of Emerson's understanding of art and Emerson's impatience with Ruskin's apparent despondency both require careful analysis. While they seem keenly perceptive, these comments can also be seen as wide of the mark or incomplete. In order to understand these mutual criticisms and the extent to which they are valid responses, it's necessary to examine more closely the qualities in each man which elicited them. Ruskin's description of Emerson, while expressed in apparently mild language, is actually severe. In Ruskinian terms, ignorance of art is not simply a social failing, but a failure of vision and imagination. Before proceeding further, we need to consider the importance of both of these concepts to Ruskin's understanding of art. For Ruskin, seeing falsely is worse than blindness. The faculty of sight was essential for Ruskin in more than a physiological sense. His whole life's work was driven by his keen powers of observation and perception. The main good of my face, Ruskin wrote in Praeterita, as of my life, is in the eyes. The education of sight was central to Ruskin's teaching from the start. Seeing clearly meant seeing rightly. For Ruskin, the dual process of looking and drawing revealed new perspectives and insights, the action of the hand aiding the power of the eye. As he put it in The Eagle's Nest, if you have any human faculty of your own, visionary appearances will take place to you, which will be nobler and more true than any actual or material appearances. In Praeterita, Ruskin recounts just such a visionary moment at Fontainebleau in 1845. And today, he writes, I found myself lying on the bank of a cart road in the sand, with no prospect whatever but that small aspen tree against the blue sky. Languidly, but not idly, I began to draw it. And as I drew, the languor passed away. The beautiful lines insisted on being traced without weariness. More and more beautiful they became as each rose out of the rest and took its place in the air. With wonder increasing every instant, I saw that they composed themselves by finer laws than any known of men. At last the tree was there, and everything that I had thought before about trees, nowhere. The woods, which I had looked on only as wilderness, fulfilled I then saw in their beauty, the same laws which guided the clouds, divided the light, and balanced the wave. He hath made everything beautiful in his time, became for me thenceforward the interpretation of the bond between the human mind and all visible things. And I returned along the wood road, feeling that it had led me far, farther than ever fancy had reached or theodolite measured. Understood in this way, drawing is not simply a way of recording facts and appearances, but a means of grasping profound truths. This is what Ruskin means in Modern Painters 5 when he declares, if you can paint one leaf, you can paint the world. True vision leads to true understanding. It is, in Ruskin's oft-quoted expression, poetry, prophecy, and religion all in one. For Ruskin, vision is connected with imagination, the virtue of which is its reaching, by intuition and intensity of gaze, a more essential truth than is seen at the surface of things. Imagination raises art above a form of pure transcript by modifying and interpreting the facts. There's a spiritual dimension to Ruskin's insistence on truth to nature, which explains why Turner's paintings, considered by many to be utterly unlike nature, were for him more true to nature than any other. Turner succeeded in communicating the far higher and deeper truth of mental vision rather than of the physical facts. For Ruskin, then, the great artist is much more than an accomplished draftsman. He's an interpreter of profound truths, able to give meaning and oracular voice to the commonest subjects. Given Ruskin's belief in the connection between art and vision, his judgment of Emerson is doubly damning. In declaring Emerson a total blank on matters of art, Ruskin not only convicts him of faulty vision, but of cutting himself off from the revelatory vision of those great artists whose interpretation of nature brings us closer to the truth. For Ruskin, the capacity for noble sight, clear in gentleness, proud in reverence, and joyful in love, is what separates humans from the lower forms of life. In this sense, it is at the heart of what it means to be human. We are not simply body, but mind and soul as well, which when joined together give us a uniquely human spiritual vision. In The Eagle's Nest, Ruskin asserts this unity. You do not see with the lens of the eye, he writes, you see through that, and by means of that, but you see with the soul of the eye. Sight is an absolutely spiritual phenomenon, accurately and only to be so defined. And the let there be light is as much, when you understand it, the ordering of intelligence as the ordering of vision. Ruskin's rejection of what he called the glacial cold of selfish science, and of Darwinism in particular, was driven by what he considered its mechanistic, soulless way of looking at the world. Yet like Ruskin, Emerson too is preoccupied by vision and perception. Indeed, one could argue that in a century characterized by oculophilia, Ruskin and Emerson were preeminent in their insistence on the power of sight. Emerson wrote often about the eye as symbolic of inquiry, knowledge, and wisdom. Like Ruskin, he felt that, quote, our schools and colleges strangely neglect the general education of the eye. Emerson returns repeatedly to the notion of impaired vision, writing of eyes that are muddied and sometimes asquint, glassed by vice, hampered by colored and distorted lenses, bound by one or another handkerchief. In Nature, Emerson declares that for the majority of people, vision is superficial, affecting only the eye and not the heart. To speak truly, he claims, few adult persons can see nature. Most persons do not see the sun. He then offers his most striking and best known ocular metaphor. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing, I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. And this is a drawing by Christopher Pierce Cranch of the transparent eyeball, a humorous drawing just to kind of balance out the profundity of Emerson's quote there. Emerson's eye is not a mediator between the soul and understanding. Here the self and the eye merge completely. The transfiguration that Emerson describes leaves him impatient of worldly ties and obligations, which become a trifle and a disturbance. Emerson's use of the word eyeball rather than simply eye results in a somewhat grotesque image, but he's chosen the word purposefully, for the spherical satellitic eyeball can be seen as a sort of self-contained world, suspended in infinite space and immersed in the universe. There's something of Emersonian self-reliance in this, for when vision and self merge, one's view is unimpeded by convention, conformity, or illusion. One is what one sees. Like Ruskin at Fontainebleau, Emerson too writes of a transformative moment of vision at Mount Auburn in April 1834. I opened my eyes and let what would pass through them into the soul. I saw no more my relation, how near and petty, to Cambridge or Boston. I heeded no more what minute or hour our Massachusetts clocks might indicate. I saw only the noble earth on which I was born, with the great star which warms and enlightens it. I saw the clouds. It was day, that was all heaven said. The pines glittered with their innumerable green pine needles in the light and seemed to challenge me to read their riddle. The drab oak leaves of the last year turned their little somersaults and lay still again, and the wind bustled high overhead in the forest top. So these two experiences, Ruskin's at Fontainebleau and Emerson's at Mount Auburn, share a similarly heightened awareness of the natural world, but there's subtle and important differences. Ruskin's vision of the aspen is intimate and immediate. In drawing the tree, he discovers its essential qualities and feels intensely the bond between man and nature. For Ruskin, the human interest is always bound up with nature, and he himself declared, that the distinctive character of his books lay in their bringing everything to a root in human passion or human hope. For Ruskin, nature was metaphorical or allegorical rather than the basis for a symbolic vision. The panoptic quality of Emerson's vision at Mount Auburn has something in common with his transparent eyeball. As the self and its earthly bonds dissolve, he seems to observe the scene from a distance. Ruskin's vision brings him closer to the tree itself. Emerson's deepens his perception of the entire world of which the tree is a part. These are both spiritual, even mystical experiences, but the insight they offer is of a different sort and leads to different results. For Ruskin, the study of nature was a call to action. The truths that he perceived through his experiences of the natural world influenced his efforts at social reform and his vision of the ideal society. The formation of crystals and the growth of leaves become for him analogies of human interdependence. Emerson is also interested in analogies of nature, but his study of nature leads him to conclude instead that, quote, every stone will fall where it is due. We need not assist the administration of the universe. Emerson images society as a wave. The wave moves onward, he writes, but the water of which it is composed does not. The same particle does not rise from the valley to the ridge. Its unity is only phenomenal. The persons who make up a nation today die next year and their experience with them. Both men believed that individual transformation was central to social change, but it is unlikely that Emerson, who described the failure of association in the essay New England Reformers, would have sympathized with Ruskin's St. George's Guild. Each man, if he attempts to join himself to others, Emerson wrote, is on all sides cramped and diminished of his proportion. But leave him alone, to recognize in every hour and place the secret soul, he will go up and down doing the works of a true member. For his part, Ruskin felt that a misplaced emphasis on individualism had resulted in the doctrine that you serve your neighbor best by letting him alone. Is not a man better than a town, Emerson declares in Self-Reliance? Ruskin would answer that good men are meant to work together to create a strong town or a strong nation. Ruskin's and Emerson's belief in the spiritual nature of vision, while certainly influenced by Christian tradition, is strongly connected also with their reading of Plato, for whom sight and soul are inextricably linked. Emerson, in his essay on Plato, calls him the great-eyed Plato. Ruskin's soul of the eye and Emerson's transparent eyeball are related, each in its own way, to Plato's assertion that the soul is like the eye. Emerson's eyeball, mingling with the currents of the universal being, looks forward to his notion of the oversoul, that universal mind, the great soul, in which man will live with a divine unity. Ruskin does not follow either Plato or Emerson so far into the ether. For him, the material world is more than a symbol of the universal mind. It's an intricate network of vital relationships. Ruskin values the flower not only for what it might tell us of the divine, but for the blessed harmonies it reveals between all forms of life. Ruskin's law of help underlies all his teaching, whereas Emerson's sense of the world's unity is closer to what he describes as Plato's perception of an all-dissolving unity, the first stair on the scale to the temple of the mind. Yet it won't do to set up too stark an opposition between Ruskin and Emerson in this regard, for Emerson too is a keen observer of the material world, taking plenty of joy in its beauty. In some passages, Emerson's understanding of the artistic imagination seems even to approach Ruskin's. When he writes that the artist values the expression of nature and not nature itself, he does not seem too far from Ruskin's notion that the aim of the great inventive landscape painter must be to give the far higher and deeper truth of mental vision rather than that of the physical facts. Yet whereas Ruskin spent his life closely observing, interpreting, and writing about art, Emerson's published writings on the subject tend to the general rather than the specific. He's concerned not with particular pictures and artists or technique and practice, but with the connection of art with eternal reason and with the mind that formed nature. Ruskin's great artist is led by imagination to the discovery of noble truths. And though there's something of the divine about him, the most wonderful piece of divine work in the whole matter, he writes, is the great human spirit through which it is manifested to us. Emerson's great artist, on the other hand, must be, quote, one through whom the soul of all men circulates as the common air through his lungs. He must work in the spirit in which we conceive a prophet to speak or an angel of the Lord to act. That is, he is not to speak his own words or do his own works or think his own thoughts, but he is to be an organ through which the universal mind acts. Ruskin's great artist, in glimpsing the divine, enriches our humanity. Emerson's great artist, in subordinating his humanity, lifts us closer to divine unity. Whereas Emerson is resolved to detach every object from personal relations and see it in the light of thought, Ruskin urges the importance of personal relations and community. Matthew Arnold wrote, "Emerson is the aider and friend of those who would live in the spirit." Adapting his words, one might say that Ruskin is the aider and friend of those who must live in the world. Emerson's worldview is essentially optimistic. "My whole philosophy," he wrote in 1841, "which is very real, teaches acquiescence and optimism. Sure I am that the right word will be spoken, though I cut out my tongue." Arnold observed in 1884 that the secret of Emerson's effect is in the hopeful, serene, and beautiful temper that governs his perception. This doctrine of compensation that Emerson formed springs from and underpins his optimistic view of the world. In the essay titled Compensation, he affirms, "Justice is not postponed. A perfect equity adjusts its balance in all parts of life. Every secret is told, every crime is punished, every virtue rewarded, every wrong redressed, in silence and certainty." This is not naivete. Emerson was no Pollyanna and no stranger to the failings of the modern world. His certainty springs from the notion that, quote, "an inevitable dualism bisects nature, such that all things are double, one against another. Thus, each action contains within it the seed of its reward or retribution. Injustice will be punished, and love will beget love." This great law of life is further implicated in the workings of fate, which for Emerson is the fruit of character, the beautiful necessity, whereas Ruskin conceives fate as For's clavigera, fortune bearing the nail, who offers to men the conditions of prosperity, and as these conditions are accepted or refused, nails down and fastens their fate forever. Startlingly, for a man who had suffered the loss of his first wife and many family members, and who would lose his young son to scarlet fever, Emerson goes so far as to find compensation in the death of loved ones. In what might be an effort to make sense of his own pain, he argues that after the initial shock, the event, quote, "assumes the aspect of a guide or genius, for it commonly operates revolutions in our way of life. And the man or woman who would have remained a sunny garden flower with no room for its roots and too much sunshine for its head, by the falling of the walls and the neglect of the gardener, is made the banyan of the forest, yielding shade and fruit to wide neighborhoods of men." Now, this stoicism may be partly rationalization, but it's certain that Ruskin, who was forever marked by the death of Rose Latouche, saw little possibility of compensation for such wrenching personal loss. "I fancy Emerson's essay on compensation must have been written when he was very comfortable," Ruskin remarked in an 1866 letter to Charles Eliot Norton. Ruskin himself was anything but comfortable at the time. Over the course of the previous decade, he had developed his own great law of life, the law of help, according to which government and cooperation are in all things and eternally the laws of life, anarchy and competition in all things and eternally the laws of death. Declaring that there is no wealth but life, he had set out to convince others of the value of the things that lead to life. Yet it seemed that the laws of death were in the ascendant. He was less sanguine than Emerson about the convertibility of men. Whereas Emerson refused to be warped from the belief that every man is a lover of truth, Ruskin warned that for all its inherent goodness, human nature is also narrow and blind and can only with difficulty conceive anything but what it immediately sees and feels. The challenge was to teach people how to see clearly and truly. Ruskin rejected Emersonian compensation not because he was stubbornly pessimistic, but because it contradicted his own experience of the world. He saw that the times were out of joint, and his own efforts had taught him the difficulty of struggling against the tide of received opinion and practice. In Time and Tide, Ruskin responds directly to Emerson's doctrine. "It is true, of course," he writes, "that in the end of ends, nothing but the right conquers. The prevalent thorn of wrong, at last, crackles away in indiscriminate flame, and of the good seed sown 1 grain in 1,000 someday comes up, and somebody lives by it. But most of our great teachers, not excepting Carlyle and Emerson themselves, are a little too encouraging in their proclamation of this comfort, not to my mind very sufficient, when for the present our fields are full of nothing but darnel instead of wheat and cockle instead of barley, and none of them seem to me yet to have enough insisted on the inevitable power and infectiousness of all evil, and the easy and utter extinguishableness of good. Medicine often fails of its effect, but poison never. And while in summing the observation of past life, not unwatchfully spent, I can truly say that I have 1,000 times seen patience disappointed of her hope and wisdom of her aim, I have never yet seen folly fruitless of mischief, nor vice conclude but in calamity." It's important to notice Ruskin's use of the phrase "for the present," because his reforming urge is always focused on today, and he took that word today as his motto, on what needs to be done and can be done in the present. This isn't to say that Ruskin doesn't look forward, but it helps to explain why Emerson's notion of compensation seems too optimistic, because it requires awaiting a result often too long in coming. Ruskin's awareness of social failure and injustice helped to darken his vision of the world. And it's ultimately this darkened perception that most effectively separates him from Emerson. Emerson's optimism extends to the idea that even evil has its uses and that good often comes of wickedness. The first lesson of history is the good of evil, Emerson declares. Good is a good, doctor, but bad is sometimes a better. The sharpest evils are bent into that periodicity which makes the errors of planets and the fevers and distempers of men self-limiting. Ruskin admits no such thing. He declares, on the contrary, that those who believe in the passing of all evil into some form of good are guilty of intellectual weakness. And he would include here Emerson. And with this, we draw closer to the root of the trouble between Ruskin and Emerson. For Ruskin, evil is not a function of the universal necessity, but a deadly reality, whose power and presence is here in the world, with us and within us, and with which we are constantly at war. He sees this power shouted forth even in nature, which is not always beneficent, but often wrathful and destructive. For all his love of the natural world, he warns against a willful blindness to the work of sin. The dark view of nature that many readers associate with Ruskin's later years has its roots in the following passage of 1853, published long before the storm cloud of the 19th century with its vision of blanched sun, blighted grass, blinded man. In the utmost solitudes of nature, Ruskin wrote, the existence of hell seems to me as legibly declared by 1,000 spiritual utterances as that of heaven. It is well for us to dwell with thankfulness of the unfolding of the flower and the falling of the dew and the sleep of the green fields and the sunshine. But the blasted trunk, the barren rock, the moaning of the bleak winds, the roar of the black, perilous, merciless whirlpools of the mountain streams, the solemn solitudes of moors and seas, the continual fading of all beauty into darkness and of all strength into dust, have these no language for us? We may seek to escape their teaching by reasoning touching the good which is wrought out of all evil, but it is vain sophistry. The good succeeds to the evil as day succeeds the night, but so also the evil to the good. As he grew older, personal loss, ill health, and a conviction of the failure of his life's work combined only to intensify Ruskin's sense of a sinister power at work in the world. He had recognized its existence years before. He glimpsed the darkness in the course of his geological studies, which yielded unsettling insights into the age of the earth and the destructive natural forces which had shaped it. The evangelicalism of his youth, with its emphasis on the antagonism between good and evil, heaven and hell, the chosen and the damned, played his part as well. Social injustice and fragmentation further intensified his sense of threatening gloom. Mechanistic science and war, materialism, competition, and selfish individualism seemed to be triumphing over the things that lead to life. Once I could speak joyfully about beautiful things, Ruskin announces in Modern Painters 5, thinking to be understood. Now I cannot anymore, for it seems to me that no one regards them. Wherever I look or travel in England or abroad, I see that men, wherever they can reach, destroy all beauty. They seem to have no other desire or hope but to have large houses and to be able to move fast. Every perfect and lovely spot which they can touch, they defile. Ruskin had also been led to consider the reality of evil through his study of art, the greatest works of which, as he saw it, demonstrated a victory of the human spirit over the power of evil. In my own field of inquiry, he explains in Modern Painters 5, all great and beautiful work has come of first gazing without shrinking into the darkness. Beginning in the 1850s, he had glimpsed this darkness in the gradual revelation of Turner's loss of faith and hope. The deeper he looked, the more dangerously sanguine did an optimism such as Emerson's appear. By the 1880s, Ruskin had begun to see the moral and spiritual deterioration of England imaged in the physical world, in the plague cloud that signaled more than just a change in the atmosphere. For Emerson, who maintained that there is no pure lie, no pure malignity in nature, Ruskin's belief in the existence of a present and corrupting evil was a betrayal of his genius. The entertainment of the proposition of depravity is the last profligacy and profanation, Emerson declared. Ruskin's vision of the world, which Emerson found so despondent, seemed to convict him of just such a profanation. In the essay Experience, Emerson connects vision with mood, figuring our moods as, quote, many colored lenses, which paint the world their own hue, and each shows only what lies in its focus. He felt that Ruskin's vision had been skewed by an unpardonable despair, a black devil that had glassed his eye. Emerson believed that we judge of a man's wisdom by his hope. Perceiving Ruskin to be without hope, Emerson questioned his wisdom. Yet even when he had been brought low by ill health and personal misfortune, Ruskin did not entirely lose hope. To the end, he held to the belief that human nature is a noble and beautiful thing, not a foul nor base thing, and that it would ultimately prove capable of transformation. Ruskin concludes the final letter of Forest Clavigera by declaring that the time has come for the faithful to be no more hidden, nor overcome of evil, but overcome evil with good, ought we not at last to redeem. Ruskin's lifelong attempt to teach people to see clearly and to live nobly was in itself an act of hope. For Ruskin, Emerson's apparent ignorance of art that was part of what made him intangible. The education of Emerson's sight being incomplete, his entire worldview was called into question. He was unable, according to Ruskin, to see rightly. Not having confronted the world's sorrow as revealed by the vision of great artists like Turner, he had failed, in Ruskin's estimation, to rightly perceive the world's darkness or to understand its implications and the necessity of action. In refusing to entertain the proposition of depravity, Emerson had blinded himself to the necessity of actively struggling against the deadly reality. Believing this, Ruskin came to doubt Emerson's teaching. By the 1880s, Ruskin's opinion of Emerson had soured markedly. In a letter of February 1883, he wrote of Emerson as little more than a clever gossip, whose egotism reiterates itself to provocation. And although a month later he described the recently published Emerson letters as infinitely sweet and wise, they were also, here and there, unintelligible to me. In an 1886 letter to the Pall Mall Gazette regarding Sir John Lubbock's list of the best 100 books, Ruskin offered an emended list, declaring, "After putting my pen lightly through the needless and blotesquely through the rubbish and poison of Sir John's list, I leave enough for a life's liberal reading, and choice for any true worker's loyal reading." Under the heading of general literature, he had drawn a heavy black line through Emerson's name. You can see where he's done that there. And that's all. Thank you very much. You want me to stop the share, Katrina?
Sure. Jim?
It's black. See, oh, look at it's a good crowd.
Jim?
Jim, I think you're muted.
He doesn't know he's muted.
No, I don't think he does.
Jim, we can't hear you.
How about now?
There we are.
Yes.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay, good. I lost my connection and I apologize for that. The techno world is complicated, as we all know. In any event, Sarah, thank you so very much. It was a wonderful talk. I certainly had never thought very much about Ruskin and Emerson in certainly the way that you've thought about Ruskin and Emerson. And I found so much of what you had to say deeply illuminating in terms of thinking about both men. I particularly loved your comments on the importance of vision and seeing in both men. And I liked it very much as well when you came around sort of near the end of your talk to talking about the connection between Plato and Emerson and Ruskin. My thought being that, you know, the old adage, and it is a true adage, that the greatest minds in the end come to the same understanding of the world because the truth of the world is one. And so we're all finally led to that by our analyses. So I thought all of that was lovely. I do have, I wanted to talk a little bit about the class issue, which you raised very early in your talk. See if you have a reaction to that and maybe we can get a conversation going. There has always been, in my view, this tension between America and the UK, particularly the America and England. And I think it comes from the entire revolutionary experience so long ago that America was seen is still seen oftentimes as a breakaway, as an upstart, as a less sophisticated set of people trying to live. Back to the notion that in that long Ruskin quote that you read, which I thought was terrific, I had never paid attention to it before, about American materialism Ruskin's great dislike of America, I think, comes around to the fact that we are in many ways a fundamentally materialistic culture, and we were founded on not only self-reliance, but self-gratification and making ourselves rich and powerful and of great image in the world. And so this tension between the US and the UK in terms of the view of the world. Ruskin wanted us to become much more gentle and humane and caring of each other. I don't think he very often doing anything of that nature. If you have any more comments on Ruskin and materialism, as they're expressed in Force Claviger, the late works, or anything else, I'd appreciate hearing of them.
Well, I think partly Ruskin's objection, I mean, it was materialism, all of those things, commercialism, and it was also objected to America's fascination with the new, the need to always be moving on to something new. I mean, Ruskin was, as I said in the talk, he was really wedded to tradition, right? And he loved history in the past and all that sense of tradition that he felt in England. He really valued that, and he writes often about it. In America was, of course, it was a new country. So, we can't be faulted on that score for not having a long past. It's just how it was. But he also saw American culture as something that was always doing away with, whatever had been established to move on to something more. It's like that, he uses the term, the goddess of getting on, when he's talking about the desire to acquire riches. But in America, there was this sense of getting on too, socially, culturally, materially. And that was something that he deplored also. Individual Americans, he had no problem with. He had quite a few American friends. Charles Eliot Norton was one of his, closest American friends. I won't talk too much about him because I have a lot of reservations about Norton myself, but he did have many American friends and got on very well with them. And there's other passages where, he expresses, regard for certain aspects of American culture, but overall, he was very doubtful and critical. I don't know if Jim is still on or not.
Of course, this is Gabe. The one of the ironies here, of course, is that some of Ruskin's most fervent disciples were Americans.
Right.
Thinking of the Alexanders and then the whole group of painters and artists around in the Norton circle that had moved to Italy and were directly involved with Ruskin. So that's an interesting paradox.
Yeah, and he really was responsible for teaching a large number of American artists how to see, right? How to look at nature, how to look at the world, how to approach art. I mean, I said in the talk that there was not a settled American aesthetic tradition, or artistic tradition. We didn't have a lot of museums and collections. We didn't have all this repository of tradition and culture to draw on that, existed in England and Europe. But Ruskin was really important to helping us establish that. Within small circles, there were people who, and then that gradually broadened out, were very interested in Ruskin's work, and bought his books and read them, and many of them got in touch with him, but tried to practice in that Ruskinian spirit. So it is kind of ironic that, for all his criticism of America and American aesthetic development, he had a hand in moving us forward.
Right, as we've talked about, even the elements of drawing and the elements of perspective from Ruskin were essential books in the arts curriculum from the 1850s well into the 20th century. And so Ruskin had this immense effect on American art education.
And even in elementary education, I've seen school books, where excerpts from Ruskin are included. They were standard along with other, great writers of the period. Ruskin was included, which has always really interested me, because a lot of Americans now, unless you have a special interest in Ruskin or come to him through another artist or thinker, generally, the wider population is not familiar with Ruskin. But, in the 19th century and into the 20th century, his work was considered, necessary to read. So, and even for young people. Tyson, I saw your comment.
Bill,
about-
if I could jump back in again, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh. Okay, well, I'd like to ask Sarah to speak. That is always, and so I'm wondering whether has given one great talk. I don't see why we need to have you give another at the same time that you're not prepared. But what do you reaction about Russ?
I can't, you keep cutting out, Jim. So I know you want to hear my reaction on something, but I can't hear what it is.
Ruskin and Thoreau.
Ruskin and Thoreau? Is that what he said?
Yes.
Next week.
Yeah, I don't want to anticipate that too much because we're going to have a talk on that next week. And then I think Gabriel's going to talk about Thoreau also. And Thoreau read Ruskin. You know, we know that he read Ruskin. You know, Thoreau also died young. So it would have been interesting to see, you know, had Thoreau lived longer, you know, what else he might have said about Ruskin. Ruskin doesn't mention Thoreau at all. He doesn't seem to have been familiar with Thoreau, although Thoreau was familiar with him. And that may be, you know, because, as I said, you know, Thoreau did not live a very long time. His books were, you know, he got to be known better later in the century. But during, you know, his own life, he was probably better known, you know, in America. I mean, I've written about Thoreau and Ruskin too, and I've lectured about them. But like I said, we're having a lecture next week, and I don't want to. No spoilers. So.
I know that we are going to have a talk at a little bit later time on Ruskin and Muir. My thinking is that what I wanted to do to everybody, I presume many people who are here tonight are aware of this, but what I would like to do is highly recommend Ken Burns' series on the national parks, which is streaming on PBS these days. 2 or 3 of the episodes of that very appropriately deal with Muir. They never mention Ruskin, but they deal with Muir, and it's very beautifully done. So if you've not seen that series, I highly recommend it as one of Ken Burns's masterpieces, and his life is strewn with masterpieces for our cultural heritage.
Yeah.
If there, I think there's something called the Congressional Medal of Honor for Regular Citizens, and I think that Ken Burns deserves one of these.
That's a really excellent series. And, you know, just touching on Muir just a bit, because he'll come up too, I think, in the next lecture next week, and certainly in Gabriel's. It's interesting too, that he, like Emerson, also felt that Ruskin's vision was too dark. And that was his major objection to Ruskin. He too read Ruskin, but that was his major objection as well. So it's interesting to see that they're kind of aligned in that regard, Emerson and Muir, in their response to Ruskin.
How would they have felt seeing today's Republican Party?
Who can know, right? Probably not good. I don't think any.
Not too dark. Ruskin would have been not dark enough. I would like to recommend a book that illuminates, for me at least, the nature of the decadence of American culture. It's a book by Kurt Anderson, and it's called Fantasyland. It suggests that we have been so distracted in the 20th and early 21st century by mediation and entertainment and self-gratification that it has eroded the whatever content that may have been earlier. Highly recommend. It's extraordinary, very entertaining, and very, very profound, I think.
Yeah, T.S. Eliot has a line, "Distracted from distraction by distraction," which I come back to in those kind of moments.
I might just throw in that, I mean, the earliest artists in America were really the cartographers and I mean, they really were drawing nature and you know, figuring out the passages, and Audubon came and you know,
Really cool.
and coal, and yeah,
Doubting.
so, but what was collected, I mean, the English artists came over here, like Thomas Hill, very early on, and were the influencers of early American art, was really drawn from the landscape, from nature.
Yeah. And then when we do start to develop, you know, a stronger tradition here, and we have these landscape painters that are really amazing. The Hudson River School, I mean, produces beautiful painting, you know, very much in a Ruskinian spirit of paying close attention to nature, you know, looking closely, seeing clearly, representing, you know, nature, but also nature, you know, filtered through the artist's mind and imagination, as Ruskin speaks about.
But the capitalists, such as actually Mark Twain and such, were bringing their art to America from Europe, from England, and they were bringing it around the Cape to build their homes on the West Coast even. So, it, you know, it took quite a while till, you know, probably 1871, I think, is when the Met is formed and some of the big institutions in America that really look at our own art.
I like your point, Sarah, about Hudson River painting, because luminism is not a realistic painting, is it? I mean, we occasionally get a moment of sunset that does elicit that kind of incredible light. But when you think of church and you know, so many of these great Sanford, Gifford, all these incredible.
Bierstadt and
Yeah,
1864.
the great luminists are essentially seeing a different light. It's an inner light that they're imposing, in a sense, upon the landscape, taking their cue from a sunset, but expanding it exponentially.
yeah.
I believe Tyson had a question.
I think it's important for us to remember that Ruskin's darkness is deep.
I think we need
Jim.
we all need to chip in and invite
Of
Jim.
the
An
evolution,
internet booster.
particularly in England.
Jim, get an internet booster. They
Yeah.
exist. They're just little boxes you stick on your system, and it helps the whole house.
Well,
Really.
I
Right.
think, Sarah, your talk was so illuminating. It was
wonderful.
really
No,
wonderful.
Great.
Oh, thank you. But what was Tyson's question, though? I
Tyson,
didn't want
you
to
had a
leave you out,
question?
Tyson.
No, I didn't. I started and then I erased it. I mean, I was going to say in general, what were the Transcendentalists as a whole fairly much in favor of Ruskin, or I don't know, did they all have individual opinions on him?
I haven't seen that there's a lot of individual opinions on him. I mean, Emerson, you know, writes about him. Thoreau read him, made a few comments about him, not extensive, enough to get a sense of how Thoreau felt about him, though. You know, Muir comments on him as well. One thing about the Transcendentalists is that, and I don't want to say that Ruskin wasn't cerebral, because he certainly was. You know, he was an intellectual and a thinking person, but the Transcendentalists are so much in their heads a lot of the time that you can see where, you know, Ruskin would find this a bit off-putting, because, you know, he's someone who's certainly in his head, but he's also in the world, and he's also looking outward all the time. My feeling about the Transcendentalists often is that they're so busy looking inward that they don't notice things the way that Ruskin did. They have a very different way of looking at the world and being in the world.
Isn't there a curious hypocrisy in the idea that the soul is an inward journey, but compassion there's not much room for compassion and community in that journey? It seems that's a kind of conundrum, and that's a paradox, really. It's paradoxical.
Yeah, and it's paradoxical to me that, you know, Emerson writes in that essay on New England reformers about association, and how he says that, you know, the association of men, of people, you know, he means people, is not the way to go. That, you know, give a man, you know, his own time and space, and he'll go up and down doing good works, but that it's not, working in community is not as effective. And yet, you know, the Transcendentalists were a community. You know, they were always spending time together and sharing ideas and things. So, you know, here's someone who was in an intellectual community, that was very aware of itself, and yet was saying that association was not the way forward. So that's interesting too. And I mean, you know, we could talk more about that. I mean, he's talking about association as far as achieving things in the world, but Emerson and Thoreau, they were not people who, you know, kept entirely to themselves. You know, this community was important to them.
And not only that, but in the communities of the cultural communities going back even to the Renaissance and you know, all the great masters, Leonardo, Michelangelo, and all of the great Italian and all the great Northern masters, individual achievement, individuation, great definition of personality occurred within the context of Christendom and within the context, I mean, go to Asia. Every community spawns individual stars. And so community is not a disincentive to individuation. I think there's a strange, strange tension there.
That there is a strange tension there. And also just reading Ruskin and reading Emerson. I mean, spend an evening sometime reading some Ruskin and then moving immediately to Emerson and then moving back. I mean, just the way that they express themselves and the way that they write is so very different. You know, when I was working on Emerson and Ruskin, and that's something I've continued to do, but I was reading a lot of Emerson because I hadn't read as much Emerson as I've read Ruskin, you know, and so, you know, this was several years back, I was kind of immersing myself in Emerson. And I would get so frustrated because I do admire Emerson, you know, very much, but I'd be sitting there reading Emerson and there were many pages and passages of very high flown, you know, language, some of which I've quoted here. And then there would be these moments of, you know, really beautiful, wise clarity. And I'd say, oh, yes, you know, that's great. And then I have to go through pages and passages more of this really dense, you know, very cerebral stuff. And so it's a very different experience, at least for me, you know, reading Emerson and reading Ruskin, where I think Ruskin is much, I think he's a much clearer writer and a much more elegant writer. So that's quite different as well. And some of that has to do with what I talked about in the lecture. You know, the kinds of things that they read, the kinds of things they were interested in. I mean, Emerson is largely coming out of this, you know, German philosophical tradition, and Ruskin found that impenetrable. He has a really funny comment about it, which I won't try and quote verbatim because I'll mess it up. But you know, about the way that the Germans wrote and thought. So it has a lot to do with it also.
Some commentators also have written, interestingly, I think, that Ruskin always argues out of concrete experience.
Yeah.
In other words, if he's arguing about nature, he's arguing about an oak leaf. He's taking the oak leaf as his starting point, and he's actually arguing his case out of the specifics, either social specifics or natural specifics, where it seems like the transcendentalists, and Emerson in particular, is almost always using nature as examples of his a priori argument or perception. So the argument's always up here in the ether, and then there may be concrete examples. Whereas Ruskin's, one of the beauties of Ruskin is that radical argumentation from the heart of experience and specificity. Yeah,
he moves always from the concrete and material to the abstract. And so we go with him willingly because he's drawn us in with that concrete example of whatever it is, the material, you know, and the experience. And so we can follow him, I think, more easily into the abstract. Whereas, you know, Emerson starts with the abstract, and that's a harder way in, you know. And I think of, you know, a poet like Robert Frost, you know, who's, you know, many years after Ruskin, and he makes no claims to be Ruskinian. There's nothing, I don't mean it that way, but a similar way of thinking and looking at the world. I mean, Frost in his poetry starts with the concrete, you know, the object, and then he moves into some philosophical idea that he wants us to think about. And we go with him. We're there for the ride because, you know, he's grabbed us and he's drawn us in with this material, concrete idea or an object. So
even more so Wallace Stevens with his red wheelbarrow.
Absolutely.
Gabriel, can you recall the quote, one of several quotes that Tolstoy made about Ruskin, in which he says Ruskin sees and observes everything that anyone can, but he more to the point, he sees things that people will observe.
If I remember, the quote is that this is a quote that from Tolstoy at the time of Ruskin's death, is my understanding. It's a eulogy to Ruskin, and he says that basically Ruskin sees what in the future everyone will see.
But he also says, Gabriel, he also says that Ruskin is one of the most unusual of men because he sees with his heart.
He sees with his heart. Right.
Very few people see with their heart. And that's what we'll all be able to do in the future.
Hope so. Well, and it's interesting too that, we're talking about Ruskin and his influence on artists in America. But he also influenced, one of our great American thinkers and activists, Martin Luther King, by way of Gandhi. So, that's very interesting as well, that social justice theory coming out of, Ruskin's ideas makes its way, kind of a circuitous way maybe, but, to MLK, so.
Yeah. Sarah, I wanted to add one more thing when you were talking about Ruskin in America. He has the famous quote where he says that he would never visit a country that had no castles.
Right.
But one of his great lines in one of the early Fors Clavigera letters is that he would never visit a country where the Almighty was a piece of paper,
Mm-hmm.
which
Yes.
I've always thought was just brilliant.
And he says at another point that he would like to blow up the city of New York, which I have to say I take offense at because I used to live in the city of New York and I love it. But that's Ruskin, that rhetorical thrust there, making a point about how he feels about America and its commercialism and all the things we've talked about already.
Well, I think we can refer to Andrew Shea's LA County Museum on fire.
Mm-hmm.
He blew up the LA County Museum, didn't he? So,
Well,
I'm not familiar with that. I'm missing the reference. I'm sorry.
oh, I'm sorry. Yes.
yeah,
Well,
that's kind of
Andrew
Right.
Shea's very famous, a very famous
a
painting.
LA reference.
I know the painter, but not remember the painting.
Mhm. And then
on,
what was
Gabe.
that lithograph we saw today of the Getty being bombed? Who did that
Oh,
one?
God, what's his name?
Victoria
Business.
Martino it asked a question whether Ruskin or Emerson read
Yeah.
German. This is in the chat.
Yeah, I believe Emerson did, although I'm not entirely positive, but I believe that he did. I think Ruskin read it poorly. Maybe poorly is too strong a word, but certainly not well. I think he could do enough to get by and get some of the ideas, but he wasn't fluent in it.
Yeah, I was asking because I have found any German text, particularly philosophical texts, in translation in English to be completely incomprehensible.
That's how Ruskin felt about them.
So, and particularly because all through history, it's been, German's one of those unusual languages where it's allowable to actually invent words as you go along.
Mhm.
And in really notable cases like Heidegger, who of course doesn't figure here because of the era,
Yeah.
but there are words which hitherto didn't even exist in German. So so I was just that's why I asked the question, because I thought that's fair enough, because in translation it's just like gobbledygook.
Yeah, and Ruskin found them too abstract. I mean, we were just talking about the concrete and the abstract and Ruskin's approach being through the concrete. The biggest objection Ruskin had, or one of the biggest objections he had to the German philosophers, was that they were too abstract. Their language is too abstract and their ideas were too abstract, and the way that they presented them was too much so.
Yeah, although oddly enough, I mean, I don't know, it's a matter of opinion, I guess, but I've always found the Germans very solidly grounded. It's sort of the opposite that I think I've found, for example, in comparison to French philosophy, which is very heady and cerebral. But anyway, I was just curious because I thought that would certainly influence their approach to German philosophy or German literature for that matter. I had one other question actually, since Gabriel drew attention to me. I was just starting to write it in the chat. What was it? Oh, yeah, about the to me, one of the big differences between Ruskin and Emerson, and I've never heard them compared before, but it's fabulous, your lecture.
Thank you.
Is that I always have thought of Ruskin as a polemicist, and Emerson is one of those very sort of stodgy, well, not stodgy, that doesn't sound fair, but I mean, Emerson, doesn't mince words. I mean, he has that American sort of, well, it's a kind of self-reliant way of writing, if you will. Whereas Ruskin comes from that long tradition of rhetoricians and orators, and so, like the burning down the city of New York, or not going to a country with castles. It's that. So, do you see that as a major difference between the two?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, Ruskin is much more, I don't want to say emotional writer, because that makes him sound like he's not in control of his writing, whereas he is. He's very much controlled, but he is very vehement, often very angry. You don't get that sort of real intense emotional tone in Emerson, which is not to say that he's always one note. That's not what I mean. But Ruskin becomes very expressive in a way that Emerson is not. I think Emerson is much more. To me, he's a much more formal writer than Ruskin is. Especially when you get to works like Fourth Clavidra, in which Ruskin is writing letters, and he's writing as he's thinking, and he's putting in what comes to mind. He's looking at newspapers and quoting articles, and current events, and all that sort of thing. So I can't imagine Emerson doing anything like that, being comfortable enough to express himself that way. Maybe I'm doing him a disservice.
No, that's the Boston Latin Harvard trajectory. In a
Yeah, there seems to be a kind of self-consciousness in Emerson. And a lot of the American thinkers of that period, to me, in the way that I perceive them at least, a self-consciousness about their own intellectualism. And that's where I see that American anxiety of coming in, the need to kind of make it clear that we're smart too, I see that when I read a lot of those writings, or at least I suspect that it's there to some degree.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. I think that's a very good point. Thank you.
And Victoria, there's such command in Ruskin's rhetoric and command of language, leavened by a humor, a sense of humor. He just comes in, he just jabs so delightfully, right in the middle of a terribly serious argument. He'll make a point, and you just can see the smile breaking out.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, Stuart, because I think that's something that's overlooked a lot in discussions of Ruskin, is that he's very funny. And people, I think, tend to think of him as this, first of all, he's this Victorian figure who tends to get labeled as very moralistic and, overbearing and opinionated and all these things, and a rhetorician, like, you're saying, and yet he's often really funny. I have, I always put marginal notes, and I have a lot of, little notes about the humor in his writing.
Very much so, but he can also be prolix. I mean, he can be, overstuffed.
Yes.
I talked to a dear friend of mine who lives at number 1 Bloomsbury in a house that Queen Anne's physician owned, Peter Nahum, who ran the Leicester Galleries in Grosvenor Square. And he said, I do love Ruskin, but he is difficult to read. I find him not difficult to read, but
yeah, I don't find him difficult either, but I'm a Victorianist.
I love reading Ruskin.
Yeah, and I'd spent my life reading 19th century material, but I teach Ruskin to my students, and that's one of the things they say. They say he could have said that in a shorter sentence. They say that a lot. Yeah, and then
Sarah, do you happen to know the book Royal Victoria? I think her name is Mary Wellman.
No.
Oh, she talks about Ruskin.
Okay.
Published in 1912 or something. I must send it to you.
That would be great. Yeah,
wonderful. It's a little bitchy too, which is great.
It's fine.
Sarah, I love the Robert Pinsky, the former poet laureate, gave us a lecture, about 4 or 5 years ago, on Ruskin's The Work of Iron and its relationship to the aesthetics of some modern poets, particularly Marianne Moore. And it was wonderful. Pinsky just said, what you have to understand is reading a Ruskin essay is it's jazz riffs.
That's a good way to put it, actually.
Yeah, he says this fabulous mind. He says he'll take a theme and then suddenly we'll be off into crystals, and then we'll be off in this direction. He said most of the time we come back to the theme in the end, but it's just such the way his mind works is so rich.
Right.
You know,
Does
so
anyone
full of
else-
illusions and
interconnections. He sees
Yeah,
everything as
interconnections.
interconnected. Yeah.
Does anyone else find him very contemporary? I find him very contemporary.
Oh, absolutely.
Well,
Yeah.
I do, although, you know, this is another discussion, but, you know, I think that, because we tend to say somebody's very modern or anything, or now when they sound like us, but I think at the time, you know, there were so many people who were thinking about all these ideas about reform, you know.
Oh, I don't mean, no, I meant his use of language, not his content.
Oh, his use of language. Okay. Yeah. No, I think so. Yeah. Yeah, I don't find him,
from time to time.
yeah, I don't find him inaccessible or hard to read. And part of that is because, I mean, I know his work so well that it's probably not fair for me to say that, because obviously I'm really familiar with it. But I'll tell you, I've had, even though students do say, you know, he could have said that in a shorter sentence, most students really like him because he's talking about issues that they're concerned about, that we're still concerned about, that we're still talking about. And I had one student say once, and it was, you know, you have these great moments when you're teaching, when a student really gets something. And the student said, you know, I had never heard of Ruskin, and I had no idea that, you know, he was writing about these things then and speaking to things that we still talk about today. And he said, and it makes me feel discouraged, though, that we're still talking about these things today, that these are still issues that we haven't, you know, really grappled with effectively. But that student was making the connections, and that was really exciting to see. So.
Wonderful.
Yeah, this is good.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, thanks everyone for a very stimulating discussion. And the feast continues next week with Professor Laura Dessau-Walls, who comes to us from the University of Notre Dame, where she teaches 19th century American literature and the history of ecological thought. Her Thoreau biography, by the way, Henry David Thoreau, A Life, among other awards, garnered the LA Times Book Festival Award for biography in 2017. Her lecture is He Who Shoots at Beauty, Thoreau on the Wings of Ruskin. A reminder that this lecture is next Thursday. So these 3 lectures on the Transcendentalists are on consecutive Thursday evenings, 5 p.m. Here, or wherever here may be, Pacific Daylight Time. For other information, including membership in the Ruskin Art Club, the history of the Ruskin Art Club, Ruskin resources galore, the Ruskin newsletter, and our YouTube channel, where this talk will shortly be posted, along with dozens of other lectures and presentations from the recent past. So when one note there is, when you access the YouTube channel, the Ruskin Art Club YouTube channel, please do subscribe. Thanks to Sarah and to Jim for such a rich and rewarding evening. And thanks to Katrina Lau, our Ruskin Art Club intern, who was at the console tonight, troubleshooting all our technical problems. Thanks, Katrina. And we will see you all next week. Thanks very much.
Yes, thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you, everyone.
Good night.
Good night.